the man Bumpy called brother. In Harlem, respect was not given by volume or by threats. It was earned in silence, through years of standing when others folded, through choosing restraint when chaos begged for blood. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. People knew his name, feared his reputation, whispered legends about his past, but very few knew the truth of the man beneath the myth. Fewer still knew the one man Bumpy had ever called his brother, not by blood, but by something far stronger. His name was Elijah Carter. Elijah wasn't famous. He didn't command rooms or carry himself with the weight of reputation. He didn't need to. Elijah was the kind of man who made space calmer just by standing in it. He ran a small auto shop on the edge of Harlem, fixing cars for people who couldn't afford new ones, charging less when he knew someone was struggling, sometimes nothing at all when pride was already costing them too much. He had hands permanently marked by grease and work, and eyes that carried the patience of someone who had seen enough hardship to know anger was a luxury. Bumpy met Elijah years earlier, long before the streets knew what Bumpy Johnson would become. Back then, Bumpy was sharp, restless, always thinking 3 steps ahead, while Elijah was steady, grounded, unshakable. They were opposites in every way that mattered, yet they fit together like parts of the same machine. When Bumpy spoke too fast, Elijah slowed him down. When Elijah hesitated, Bumpy pushed him forward. And when the world showed its teeth, they faced it side by side. Harlem in those days was beautiful and brutal at the same time. Jazz spilled from doorways, laughter mixed with sirens, and hope lived right next to desperation. It was a place where men learned early that survival required both strength and wisdom. Bumpy learned strength quickly. Wisdom came slower, mostly from Elijah. Whenever Bumpy's temper flared, Elijah was there. Power without control ruins itself, he'd say quietly, never lecturing, never raising his voice. And somehow, Bumpy listened, not because he had to, but because he trusted him. Years passed. The world changed. Bumpy's name grew heavier, his presence more commanding. Elijah stayed the same. Same shop, same calm voice, same refusal to ask for protection, even when it was offered. "I don't need guards," he once told Bumpy with a faint smile. "I've got respect." Bumpy didn't argue, but something in his chest tightened that day. Trouble doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine. One late evening, Elijah stayed longer than usual at the shop. A neighbor's delivery truck had broken down, and the man needed it running by morning. Elijah could have said no. He didn't. He never did. The streetlights flickered as the shop door finally closed, the quiet hum of Harlem settling into night. He never made it home. The news reached Bumpy just before dawn, not through police channels, not through gossip, through silence. Elijah's shop didn't open that morning. His phone went unanswered, and when Bumpy arrived at the garage himself, he felt it immediately, the wrongness in the air, the stillness that didn't belong. The place had been disturbed, but not wrecked. Tools lay where they shouldn't. A chair was overturned. The floor bore signs of struggle, subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew how to read a room. Bumpy didn't speak. He didn't shout. He stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, memorizing every detail. 6 men. That was what the whisper said. 6 men who thought Elijah was an easy target. 6 men who believed kindness was weakness. They weren't from Harlem, not truly. Outsiders, chasing control, testing boundaries, convinced that fear was the fastest currency. They were wrong. Elijah's body was found hours later, abandoned where the city discarded things it didn't want to see. The official reports were cold, stripped of context and humanity. To the system, Elijah was another statistic. To Bumpy, he was the anchor that had kept him human. Bumpy did not cry in public. He did not break things or make speeches. He went home, closed the door, and sat alone in the dark. Memories came uninvited. Shared meals, late-night conversations, arguments that ended in laughter. Elijah telling him, "One day you'll be tested in a way power can't solve." At the time, Bumpy had laughed. Now those words echoed like a warning fulfilled. By noon, Harlem felt the shift. Something had changed. People spoke more softly. Even those who didn't know Elijah felt it, a pressure in the air, the sense that the city itself was holding its breath. Bumpy moved through the streets calmly, greeting people as he always did, but his eyes were different, focused, final. He gathered information without threats. Names surfaced, routes, associations. He learned not just who the 6 men were, but who they were trying to impress, what they were running from, and how little they understood the world they'd stepped into. Bumpy didn't rush. He never rushed when it mattered. Revenge was easy. Justice was complicated. Elijah believed in consequences that taught, not destroyed. Bumpy wrestled with that. Every instinct in him screamed for immediate retribution, but another voice, quieter, steadier, kept him still. His brother's voice. When the 6 men were finally found, they were surprised by how calm Bumpy was. No shouting, no grand threats, just a quiet authority that made their bravado dissolve. He didn't touch them, didn't insult them. He simply looked at each one, as if weighing not their crime, but their understanding of it. You thought no one would care. That's the mistake that changes everything. What happened next would become legend, exaggerated and twisted over time. People would tell the story differently depending on who they wanted Bumpy to be, a monster or a myth. The truth was more restrained, more deliberate. What Bumpy planned was not about cruelty. It was about a message that would ripple far beyond 6 men. A single truck waited in an empty lot, engine silent, heavy with implication, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Harlem watched from a distance, sensing that something decisive was unfolding, something that would redefine lines that should never have been crossed. As the sun dipped low, Bumpy stood alone for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the fading light. "You were right," he whispered, to no one and to Elijah at the same time. This test isn't about power. It was about what kind of man he would choose to be next. And Harlem would never forget the choice he made. The weight of silence. The empty lot did not feel empty once the men arrived. Sound has a way of carrying meaning, and that afternoon even the smallest noise felt amplified. The scrape of shoes against gravel, the distant hum of traffic, the low idle of the truck waiting like an unanswered question. Bumpy Johnson stood apart from the scene, his posture calm, almost reflective, as though he were attending something solemn rather than confronting 6 men whose actions had shattered the one bond he had guarded most fiercely. Harlem had taught him many lessons, but none heavier than the truth that once a line was crossed, it could never be redrawn in the same place again. The 6 men were nervous, though they tried to hide it behind jokes and forced confidence. They had expected fury, maybe chaos, something loud and immediate. What unsettled them instead was the absence of it. Bumpy did not rush them, did not pace, did not raise his voice. He allowed silence to do the work, because silence forces a man to hear his own thoughts, and for the first time since that night, their thoughts were no longer drowned out by bravado or group strength. One by one, their eyes drifted toward the truck, then back to Bumpy, searching his face for clues that never came. Bumpy spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the permanence of what words could become once released. He talked about Elijah not as a victim, but as a man. He spoke of how Elijah had lived, how he had treated people, how his shop had been a refuge for those the city ignored. He described moments the 6 men could not have known. Elijah fixing a car late at night so a mother could get to work.
Elijah refusing payment from a struggling neighbor, Elijah believing that respect multiplied when it was given freely. The men shifted uneasily, realizing that they had not just taken a life, but erased something that had quietly held a corner of Harlem together. "What you didn't end with him," Bumpy said, his voice steady. "It reached farther than you'll ever be able to run." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty, and that certainty weighed heavier than threats ever could. The men began to understand that this moment was not about fear, but about being seen fully, without excuses, without distance. They were being forced to confront themselves in a way the streets rarely demanded. Bumpy turned away from them briefly, looking out toward the neighborhood beyond the lot. Harlem was alive in the distance, unaware of the exact shape of the reckoning taking place, yet deeply aware that something fundamental was shifting. Power in Harlem had always been about control, but Bumpy knew control achieved through terror was fragile. Elijah had believed that lasting influence came from boundaries that were understood, not tested. Bumpy felt the tension between who he had been and who Elijah had always believed he could be, and that tension shaped every decision he made next. When Bumpy faced the men again, his message became clear. This was not about spectacle. It was about consequence that would echo. He told them they would live with what they had done, not just in memory, but in reputation. Their names would follow them. Doors would close. Alliances would vanish. Harlem would remember Elijah, and it would remember who dishonored him. In a city built on stories, this was a sentence that could not be appealed. One of the men finally spoke, his voice unsteady, trying to bargain with promises and explanations that came far too late. Bumpy listened without interruption, then shook his head once, slowly. "Understanding comes before forgiveness," he replied, "and you're not there." It was not cruelty that stopped the conversation, but finality. Bumpy was not interested in domination. He was interested in ensuring that what happened to Elijah would never be mistaken as acceptable, profitable, or repeatable. As the situation concluded, there was no celebration, no release of tension, no sense of victory. Bumpy felt only exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones after carrying too much weight for too long. He knew the story would spread, altered by distance and imagination, but he also knew the truth of it would be enough. Harlem did not need details, it needed clarity. That night, Bumpy returned home alone. The city outside his window pulsed with life, indifferent and relentless. He poured a drink he did not finish and sat in the quiet, replaying conversations that would never happen again. Elijah's voice lingered in the room, not accusing, not praising, simply present. For the first time since the loss, Bumpy allowed himself to feel the grief fully, without armor, without strategy. It came heavy and slow, not as rage, but as understanding. He realized then that the true cost of power was not what it demanded from others, but what it demanded from the one who wielded it. Elijah had always known this. Elijah had chosen a life where influence came from trust, not fear. Bumpy wondered if it was too late to honor that lesson in ways that mattered beyond this single moment. By morning, Harlem would wake to rumors, to half-truths, to warnings whispered on corners. But beneath all of it would be a deeper shift, one that could not be traced to a single action. Boundaries had been reinforced, not through chaos, but through resolve. And for the first time, Bumpy felt that Elijah's presence had not vanished with his life. It had settled into the city itself, shaping what came next. The brother Bumpy had lost was gone, but the brother's influence had only just begun to speak.
What power leaves behind. Time did not slow after Elijah's death. If anything, it accelerated, as if Harlem itself were eager to move forward while carrying the weight of what had happened beneath its stride.
In the days that followed, Bumpy Johnson noticed the change not in dramatic confrontations or sudden challenges, but in the smallest interactions. Conversations paused when he entered a room, not out of fear, but out of recognition. People looked at him differently now, as if they were no longer sure which version of him stood before them. The man of legend had acted, yes, but he had done so without spectacle, and that unsettled expectations more than violence ever could. Bumpy spent more time walking the neighborhood alone. He passed Elijah's closed shop often, stopping just long enough to take in the stillness behind the dusty windows. The garage had once been a place of constant motion, of small problems being solved with patience and care. Now it stood as a reminder of something Harlem had lost, something it hadn't protected well enough. Bumpy understood that power did not absolve him from responsibility, it magnified it. The question that followed him everywhere was not whether he could enforce boundaries, but whether he could help build something that didn't require enforcement at all. People began coming to him differently, too, not asking for favors, not seeking protection, but asking questions, quiet questions about what would happen next, about whether things would calm down or harden. Bumpy answered carefully, knowing that every word he offered would be carried far beyond its original audience. He spoke of restraint, about consequences, about the danger of mistaking fear for respect. Some listened, others nodded without understanding. Change, he knew, was never immediate and rarely unanimous. At night, when the city finally softened its grip, Bumpy wrestled with memories he had long kept locked away. Elijah's presence had been the one thing that grounded him when ambition threatened to outrun wisdom. Without that anchor, Bumpy felt the pull of old instincts, urging him toward harsher methods, quicker resolutions. But alongside those instincts was something newer and more uncomfortable, the realization that Elijah had trusted him to do better, not just survive. That trust felt heavier than any threat Harlem had ever thrown his way. The 6 men faded from the forefront of Bumpy's thoughts, not because their actions were forgiven, but because they were no longer the center of the story. They had been a catalyst, nothing more. The real challenge lay ahead in the choices Bumpy would make when no one was watching, when restraint offered no immediate reward. He began redirecting influence quietly, supporting community efforts Elijah had believed in, keeping certain streets calmer, not through intimidation, but through presence and consistency. It was slower work, less visible, and far more difficult. Harlem responded cautiously at first. Trust, once broken too many times, does not return easily. But small shifts began to appear. Disputes were brought to Bumpy before they escalated. Younger men watched more closely, noticing not just what he did, but what he refused to do. Stories spread, not exaggerated legends, but measured accounts of a man who had drawn a line and chosen not to cross it again. In a city that survived on stories, this mattered more than Bumpy initially realized. One evening, an older woman stopped Bumpy on the street. She had known Elijah, relied on his kindness more than once. She didn't thank Bumpy or praise him. She simply said, "He'd be proud of how you're carrying this." The words struck harder than any insult could have. Pride had never been Bumpy's goal, but knowing he hadn't betrayed Elijah's faith gave him something he hadn't felt since the loss: direction. Still, doubt lingered. Power, once accumulated, resists change. Allies questioned his softer approach. Rivals tested his patience, mistaking silence for weakness. Each moment forced Bumpy to choose again, to reaffirm not just his authority, but his intent. He learned that restraint was not passive. It required constant vigilance, constant recommitment. There were nights he wondered if this path would ultimately cost him everything he had built, and whether Elijah's way was even possible in a place shaped by survival. Yet each morning, Harlem answered those doubts in subtle ways. A shop reopened without incident. A conflict ended before it turned ugly. A young man chose to walk away from a fight because he believed there were better options. These were not victories that made headlines, but they were the kind that lasted. Bumpy began to see Elijah's influence not as something lost, but as something transferred, carried forward through choices that honored his memory without imitating his life. By the end of that season, Bumpy understood something that power alone could never teach him. Legacy is not defined by what you take or control, but what continues after you step back. Elijah had never sought to shape Harlem, yet he had done so simply by living with integrity. Bumpy realized that his greatest test was still unfolding, not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet consistency of doing what was right when it was hardest. The city did not suddenly become peaceful, nor did Bumpy become something he wasn't, but a foundation had been laid, one that balanced strength with conscience, authority with accountability. And though Elijah was no longer there to steady him, his influence guided Bumpy forward, reminding him that the truest form of brotherhood does not end with death, but challenges the living to become better than they were before.
The line that remained. Seasons changed, as they always did, and Harlem adjusted in ways that were quiet enough to escape headlines, but deep enough to alter its rhythm. Bumpy Johnson felt the passage of time more sharply now, not because he was slowing down, but because every decision carried the echo of what had been lost and what still needed protecting. Elijah's absence no longer felt like a wound that bled constantly. It had become a weight that steadied him, reminding him to measure his steps carefully, to consider not just the outcome of his actions, but the example they set. The influence Bumpy wielded matured into something less volatile and more deliberate. He learned when to intervene and when to let people resolve their own disputes, understanding that real strength did not require constant display. Harlem's younger generation watched him closely, learning not from speeches, but from patterns. They saw a man who could have ruled through fear choose instead to enforce boundaries through consistency and consequence. This shift did not make the streets gentle, but it made them clearer, and clarity often prevented the kind of chaos that destroyed lives without warning. Elijah's shop eventually reopened, not as a business, but as a community space supported quietly by Bumpy and others who had been touched by Elijah's kindness. It became a place where young men learned skills, where disputes were talked through before tempers flared, where work replaced idle anger. Bumpy never put his name on the door. He didn't need recognition. Knowing that Elijah's spirit continued in a tangible way mattered more than ownership ever could. The shop stood as proof that loss could be transformed into purpose if handled with care. There were moments when Bumpy was tested one final time, when rivals attempted to provoke him into returning to the methods that had built his reputation in the first place. Each time, he felt the old instincts rise, sharp and familiar, but he also felt Elijah's presence like a steady hand on his shoulder. He chose restraint not because it was safer, but because it was harder, and because it carried the potential to change something beyond a single confrontation. In choosing that path again and again, Bumpy reshaped not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. As years passed, stories about Bumpy Johnson continued to circulate, some accurate, others exaggerated, but one truth remained consistent. There was a moment when he could have let grief turn him into something ruthless, and he refused. That refusal became his quiet legacy. People spoke less about the truck and more about the line he drew afterward, the one that said some things would never again be tolerated and others would be built with patience instead of fear. Harlem remembered Elijah not as a tragedy, but as a turning point.
On a late afternoon, much like the one that had started everything, Bumpy stood alone near the shop, watching the neighborhood move around him. Children laughed, vendors called out, music drifted from open windows. Life, imperfect and resilient, carried on. Bumpy understood then that brotherhood was not just about loyalty in moments of conflict, but about honoring someone's values long after they were gone. Elijah had believed in people when it was easier not to, and that belief outlived him. Bumpy never claimed redemption because he knew life did not work that way. What he claimed instead was responsibility. Responsibility to the past that shaped him, to the present that tested him, and to a future that would judge not his power, but his restraint. In that understanding, he found a peace that ambition had never offered him before. The city did not become perfect, and neither did Bumpy. But something essential had shifted. A line had been drawn, not in anger, but in purpose, and that line remained long after the noise faded. The man Bumpy called brother had changed Harlem without ever trying to control it, and in the end, Bumpy honored him not through vengeance, but through choice. And that choice became the story worth remembering.